right now, I mean, at this exact moment, you have these massive tech companies pouring just hundreds of billions of dollars into machines that are so fundamentally hungry for power.
Oh, they're incredibly hungry.
Right.
Yeah.
They are literally single-handedly keeping decades-old coal plants from shutting down. Like, we are actually watching utilities delay their clean energy transitions just to keep the lights blinking in these server farms.
Sewer farms that are, frankly, the size of small cities at this point.
Exactly. And all of this capital, all of the copper, the water, the coal, the silicon, it's all being mobilized to build this machine that the people in charge promise will eventually solve all our problems.
Yeah, the promise is huge.
They're saying it's going to give humanity unlimited free time. But, I mean, what happens if they're actually right?
Well, that is the multi-trillion-dollar question right there. Because the promise being made in these sleek, glass-walled tech boardrooms right now, it isn't just about a new software product.
Right.
It is a promise about the fundamental restructuring of human civilization. I mean, they are promising a post-scarcity world.
Which is wild to think about. And look, if you're listening to this and you are sitting in your college energy economics class right now, especially when you are, running your demand models for 2030 or 2035.
You're usually looking at normal variables, right?
Exactly. You're looking at things like electric vehicle adoption or population growth.
Yeah.
Maybe factory output.
Standard stuff.
Right. But artificial intelligence introduces this completely different, almost infinite variable into your equations. The boardroom pitch is basically that when you pair AI, this machine that can think and design at a scale humans just can't, with the massive amounts of clean power coming onto the grid, you break the fundamental rules of economics.
You deliver a world of absolute abundance.
Yes, absolute abundance.
What's fascinating here is how seductive that vision really is. The idea that we are about to solve the basic struggle for survival and resources, and not just for, a few wealthy nations, but at a civilizational scale.
And that is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. We're going to take this modern, cutting-edge promise of AI-driven, clean energy abundance, and we are going to test it.
But not just with tech PR or white papers.
No, definitely not. We are going to test it against the cultures that actually lived through massive, world-altering resource surpluses.
A real historical laboratory.
Exactly. We are talking about the salmon coast of the Pacific Northwest, the chinampa floating gardens of the Aztecs, the goldwork of the Musga in the Andes.
The stone moai of Rapa Nui.
Yes, and the living textile art of the Guna people.
Which is such a vital exercise, I think. Because history really is the only laboratory we have for testing these massive societal shifts.
I totally agree.
I mean, every single one of those cultures began with the exact same thing those modern tech executives are promising today, a surplus.
Like a literal physical surplus.
Yeah, right. A river so completely choked with salmon you could practically walk across it. Or a lake bed engineered to grow 7 crops a year. What those societies experienced was a physical, ecological version of the technological surplus being promised right now.
So our central question today is whether abundance automatically buys a utopia. The hypothesis we've seen throughout our research is that a massive energy or resource surplus buys free time.
And humans consistently take that free time and turn it into culture.
Right. They turn it into monuments, art, myth. But the flip side, and this is the thing you have to understand if you are studying the future of energy grids and digital economies, is whether that surplus distributes itself evenly.
That's the catch, isn't it?
It always is. When a society gets more than it needs, who actually gets the free time?
Right, because if we are building the next massive surplus right now, we really need to know what actually happens the day after survival is solved.
Okay, so let's start with the most optimistic version of this modern claim. Let's really steel man the boardroom promise here because there are incredibly brilliant, informed people making this case.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very robust argument.
To build this modern age of abundance, you essentially need 2 main ingredients: limitless energy and limitless intelligence.
And on the energy side, the optimists look at the actual cost curves. We aren't just talking about abstract hopes here.
Right, we're talking hard data.
Exactly. Solar plus storage has genuinely become the cheapest new electricity generation globally in many markets. I mean, the cost curve for solar panels has been bending downward following Wright's law.
Wait, remind everyone what Wright's law is really quickly.
Sure. It essentially states that for every cumulative doubling of production, the cost falls by a constant percentage. And we have seen that drop precipitously over 2 decades for solar.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. When you say solar plus storage, you mean not just the panels, but the batteries required to keep the power flowing when the sun goes down, right?
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Because the critique of solar was always, the intermittency, what happens at night.
Or when it's cloudy.
Right. But the cost of utility-scale lithium-ion battery storage has just plummeted right alongside the panels. So you are looking at a future grid flooded with clean, near-zero marginal cost power.
Wow.
And then, if you pair that with the lingering promise of nuclear fusion, which, yes, is still pre-commercial.
But getting closer, right.
Very much so. We're seeing massive breakthroughs in magnetic confinement and plasma stability. So the vision is a world where energy is just no longer a constraint at all.
And then you layer artificial intelligence on top of that cheap power, because AI is the machine that takes that raw power and actually applies it.
Exactly. It's a surplus that can literally improve itself.
Right. It's designing better grid logistics, discovering new battery chemistries, writing code faster than 1,000 human engineers could ever dream of.
And this is where we can draw a direct line to our first historical witness. Because if we look back at the Pacific Northwest coast centuries ago, we see a direct ecological parallel to this modern technological dream.
The salmon run.
Yes, the indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, they had an ecological surplus that fundamentally altered how their society operated.
It is just such an incredible biological phenomenon.
It really is. We are talking about predictable, incredibly dense annual salmon runs combined with these vast, towering cedar forests.
And the sheer volume of food, right.
Exactly. The ecology was so rich that a community could secure an entire year's worth of calories in just a few weeks of intensive fishing during the autumn run.
Hold on, so you're saying a handful of weeks catching fish literally funded a whole society's caloric needs for the rest of the entire year?
Yes.
That sounds almost impossible.
It does sound implausible, but you have to look at the mechanics of it. They weren't just catching fish. They had mastered the technology of preservation. They used highly specialized smokehouses to cure the salmon. This effectively removed the moisture and prevented bacterial growth, so that high-density protein could be stored indefinitely.
So it's not just the resource, it's the technology to capture and keep it.
Precisely. A few weeks of intense labor harvesting and smoking the salmon bought them a months-long winter leisure season for the entire community. It was a true post-scarcity environment, at least relative to their immediate survival needs.
Man, this maps so perfectly to the AI discussion. Let me try to build out an analogy here for anyone analyzing these modern tech economies.
Go for it.
If limitless clean energy is the salmon run, right, like the raw incoming calories or kilowatts that arrive in massive waves, then artificial intelligence is the smokehouse.
Oh, that's a really fascinating way to frame it. How so?
Think about it. Raw electricity, just like raw fish, is incredibly perishable.
True. If you don't use it, you lose it.
Right. If you don't use it the second it's generated, it just dissipates. The smokehouse preserves the value of the fish over time. Well, AI preserves the value of the electricity by converting it into automated software code, or logistics networks, or medical diagnostics.
Things that permanently store human labor.
Exactly. So we don't have to do it ourselves later. AI is basically the infrastructure that converts a raw energy surplus into usable human free time.
That is exactly the mechanism the optimists are describing today. AI handles the drudgery, it automates the supply chains, the legal document review, the basic coding, all that data analysis.
It does the heavy lifting of sustaining civilization.
Just as the stored salmon sustained the Pacific Northwest communities through the long winter.
Okay, so what did those indigenous communities do with all that freed up winter time? Because they definitely didn't just sit around staring at the walls of their cedar houses.
Far from it. They shifted entirely from a survival economy to a ceremonial one. They spent thousands of hours master carving cedar longhouses. They wove these incredibly intricate chilkat blankets from mountain goat wool and cedar bark.
I've seen pictures of those. They are stunning.
And they designed complex, articulated masks with moving parts for their theatrical performances. And of course, they carved the towering totem poles.
The totem poles are really the perfect visual representation of this. I mean, you don't spend thousands of hours carving a 60-foot cedar log if you are worried about where your next meal is coming from.
Exactly. The totem pole functioned as a massive visible record of lineage, history, and myth. It wasn't a functional tool for survival. It was the surplus made visible.
The surplus made visible. I love that.
The cultural payoff of abundance was an explosion of art and meaning-making.
Which is the exact utopia the Silicon Valley boardrooms are pitching right now.
Right.
Freed from the basic necessity of wage labor, humanity will spend its time on higher pursuits. We got the modern equivalent of the winter dance dramas and the totem poles. We write poetry, we explore space, we cure diseases.
It is a beautiful vision. And, historically speaking, the instinct is real. Humans really do fill free time with art and monument.
But, I mean, I'm looking at this from the perspective of an economics student, and the math just stops working for me when we hit the concept of distribution.
In what way?
Well, if goods and services approach a zero marginal cost, meaning it costs virtually nothing to produce one more unit of a thing because the AI and the robots are doing all the labor, doesn't our entire concept of work completely break down?
It absolutely breaks down. Totally.
Right. Because in our current system, your job is your survival. You sell your time and your physical or mental labor to buy your calories and your shelter.
That's the fundamental social contract of capitalism.
Yes. So, if the machine can do your job 1,000 times faster for pennies on the dollar, what replaces the paycheck? The AI isn't going to just pay my rent because it thinks I'm a nice person.
No, it certainly isn't. And this leads us directly into the modern distribution theories that are trying to solve this exact bottleneck.
The theories on how we actually survive this transition.
Right. If the marginal cost of labor drops to near zero, how do humans claim a share of that surplus? The most famous proposal, which has gained massive traction, is universal basic income, or UBI.
Right. The idea of just cutting everyone a monthly check, which is funded by taxing the massive productivity gains of the AI engines.
Yes, a literal cash floor. But there are other more structurally profound models out there, too.
Like what?
Well, consider the writer Aaron Bastani. In his 2019 book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, he argues against a simple cash UBI. He instead advocates for something called universal basic services.
Universal basic services. Okay, so instead of giving me $1,000 a month to go buy healthcare and housing on the private market, the system just provides the healthcare and the housing directly.
Exactly. Bastani's argument is that automation, advanced robotics, and synthetic biology, which is the ability to engineer biological systems to produce materials or food, can completely abolish physical scarcity. Therefore, he argues, we shouldn't just be handing out survival stipends in a market economy. The state should be guaranteeing a high baseline standard of living.
So housing, healthcare, public transportation, education, all directly provided.
Yes, funded by the automated surplus. His banner image is luxury for all, not austerity for all.
Okay, this is where the history completely validates the theory. Because this immediately makes me think of the Aztec chinampa system.
Oh, it's a perfect parallel.
The chinampas were basically the historical, physical embodiment of universal basic services.
Let's really break down the mechanics of the chinampas because the engineering is just staggering.
Yes. Please explain how they actually worked. Because when you hear floating gardens, it sounds like a myth or something out of a fantasy novel. But it was hard infrastructure.
It was incredibly sophisticated hydrology and agriculture.
Oh.
So the Valley of Mexico contained this massive shallow lake system, primarily Lake Texcoco.
Okay.
The Aztecs, or the Mexica, would drive thick wooden stakes into the shallow lake bed in a rectangular shape. Then they would weave branches between the stakes to create an underwater fence.
Like a massive aquatic basket.
Exactly, a huge underwater basket. And then they would dredge up the nutrient-dense muck and decaying organic matter from the bottom of the lake, and they'd pile it inside that fenced area until it rose above the water level.
That is wild.
And it gets better. They would plant native willow trees at the corners. The roots of the willows would grow down into the lake bed, acting as living anchors to hold the entire artificial island together.
That is just brilliant engineering. And because they were surrounded by water, they never had to wait for rain, right?
Right. They were completely self-irrigating. The porous soil just drew water up continuously. And the soil was so hyper-fertile from that lake muck that they didn't just grow one crop a year.
How many did they get?
They could yield up to 7 crops a year on the exact same plot without depleting the soil.
7 crops a year? That's insane.
It was an agricultural engine of almost unbelievable power. 10,000 hectares of these chinampas fed the massive city of Tenochtitlan, which had a population of roughly 200,000 people, for 2 centuries.
And here is the economic parallel for you, the listener. Because that baseline guarantee of enough food was structurally engineered into the very landscape, it created a massive surplus. Not everyone had to be a farmer anymore.
Exactly.
And that baseline guarantee is what allowed them the time and the specialized labor to build the monumental Templo Mayor, or to carve the massive complex basalt sunstone.
It gave them the time to develop logosyllabic writing, too.
Right. Explain what logosyllabic writing is real quick.
It's a system where symbols represent both whole words and phonetic syllables. It allows for incredibly complex historical and poetic recording.
Right, and you just don't develop complex writing systems if everyone in the society is busy foraging for berries all day.
No, you don't.
The chinampas is the historical equivalent of universal basic services. You engineer a system where the staple necessity is guaranteed, and people will spend their free time on something higher.
It's a perfect parallel.
Yeah.
The raft is the engineered guarantee of enough. But, if we go back to your earlier point about work and worth,
Yeah.
if your basic needs are met, whether by a chinampa or by a 2026 AI network, how do you prove your status?
Oh, that's the big question.
Because human beings are intensely competitive creatures. We don't just stop wanting to be recognized or wanting to be at the top of the social hierarchy just because our rent is paid.
No, we definitely don't. We just invent new games to win. So how did historical post-scarcity societies handle human ego?
This is where we really have to return to the Pacific Northwest coast. They had a fascinating economic philosophy for dealing with status in a post-scarcity environment. It was an institution called the potlatch.
The potlatch. Okay, if you grew up in a traditional capitalist system where whoever dies with the most toys wins, the mechanics of the potlatch will completely break your brain.
It really flips everything upside down.
Explain how it functioned.
Well, in the potlatch system, status, rank, and political power were not won by hoarding wealth. They were won by giving away surplus.
Giving it away.
Yes. A chief or a leading family would host these massive, elaborate, multi-day feasts. They would invite rival chiefs and neighboring clans. And during these events, the host would literally give away vast amounts of their stored wealth.
What kind of wealth are we talking about?
We're talking about hundreds of intricately woven blankets, massive quantities of preserved food, carved canoes, and these highly valuable hammered copper shields.
And the logic here wasn't just blind charity, right? Like, it was highly calculated.
Oh, it was aggressively political.
Yeah.
The logic was basically, I am the most powerful, capable, and wealthy person in this region, and I can prove it by showing you that this massive pile of wealth means nothing to me. I can afford to part with it, and you are now in my debt.
Wow. They converted physical surplus into social and political capital. And didn't it sometimes escalate into literal destruction? Like they would just destroy things.
Yes, it did. In some extreme cases of rivalry, to prove absolute dominance, a chief wouldn't just give away a valuable copper shield, he would break it or throw it directly into the ceremonial fire.
Just to show he could.
Right. It was the ultimate flex. It was status earned through radical distribution and the deliberate destruction of scarcity.
Okay, this is where it gets incredibly relevant for our modern tech economy, and especially for anyone studying digital marketplaces right now. Because if you look closely, we are already seeing the potlatch happen today.
Oh, without a doubt.
The digital potlatch is real. Just look at open source software and Creative Commons culture.
The parallels are striking, aren't they?
They are identical. I mean, think about platforms like GitHub. You have these brilliant software developers, literally some of the smartest engineers in the world, whose labor is worth hundreds of dollars an hour. They spend thousands of hours writing incredibly complex code, say a new machine learning library or a server infrastructure tool, and then they just give it away for free. They release it open source to the public.
And why do they do that, structurally speaking?
Because in that specific digital subculture, your status, your reputation, and your rank in the community are determined by the quality of the code you contribute.
Right.
You earn massive prestige by giving your surplus labor away. When a developer creates a wildly popular open source project, they become digital royalty. They don't hoard the code to charge a toll. They give it away to build social capital.
And what is so fascinating about this is that modern post-scarcity optimists take this exact dynamic and extrapolate it out into the AI-abundant future.
How so?
Well, if an AI handles all the basic production of food, shelter, and material goods, the entire human economy might shift toward this kind of reputation or gift economy.
So you don't work for a wage anymore, you work for standing.
Exactly. Rank is earned by what you release to the public, whether that's art, code, scientific ideas, or community service, not what you hoard in a private bank account.
That makes total sense.
The drive for status doesn't vanish, it just changes its currency from hoarded capital to distributed gifts.
It is genuinely mind-blowing to realize that the absolute cutting edge of 2026 digital culture, the frontier of post-capitalist theory, is essentially mimicking an indigenous winter-giving feast from centuries ago.
It just demonstrates that human behavior has consistent, predictable patterns when confronted with abundance.
All right, so that is the beautiful optimistic vision. The AI salmon run buys us the free time. We establish a baseline of universal basic services like the chinampas, and we spend our lives in a digital potlatch of creative giving. It sounds incredible, but...
But there is a ledger.
Yeah.
And as an energy economics student, you know that every engine requires fuel.
Yes, and this is the skeptical pivot, because all of this digital potlatch culture and all this open source generosity, it assumes that the infrastructure running it is invisible and infinite.
And it's not.
No, it's not. It's built of concrete, copper, and coal. And the abundance machine we are building right now is astonishingly hungry.
It is arguably one of the most resource-intensive infrastructures humanity has ever attempted to deploy.
Let's lay out the hard numbers because they're staggering, and we really need to understand the physical reality of the cloud here.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the International Energy Agency's April 2025 Energy and AI report. In the year 2024, they estimated that global data centers consumed roughly 415 to 460 terawatt hours of electricity.
Let's pause and put that in context for a layperson, because a terawatt hour is a huge abstraction.
It really is.
1 terawatt hour is a billion kilowatt hours. The average American home uses about 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. So we are talking about the power equivalent of tens of millions of homes.
Wow.
That 460 terawatt hours represents about 1.5% of all global electricity demand. That is the equivalent of the total power consumption of a mid-sized industrial country, just to run the servers.
And that was in 2024. The IEA projects that by 2030, that number is going to more than double, surpassing 1,000 terawatt hours. And by 2035, on a generation basis, they are looking at roughly 1,300 terawatt hours.
The growth curve is vertical.
It is. Data center power demand is growing about 4 times faster than total electricity demand overall.
And we have to look at why it's growing so fast.
Yeah.
Because it's not just that more people have smartphones. It is the fundamental architecture of artificial intelligence itself.
Right. Explain the hardware shift here, because standard cloud computing like hosting a website or storing photos on your phone doesn't use nearly this much juice.
Correct. Traditional cloud computing relies on CPUs, or central processing units.
Okay.
They are designed to handle tasks sequentially, one at a time, and they are relatively efficient.
Okay.
But training and running large language models requires GPUs, or graphics processing units. GPUs are designed for massive parallel processing.
Meaning doing thousands of mathematical calculations simultaneously.
Exactly. That parallel processing is what makes AI possible. But GPUs draw astronomically more power. And consequently, they generate a massive amount of heat.
Which brings us to the water problem.
Right. You can't just cool a massive cluster of AI GPUs with a ceiling fan.
You definitely cannot.
You need highly sophisticated, water-intensive cooling systems. Large AI facilities draw massive amounts of water, evaporating millions of gallons just to keep the silicon from melting.
And this puts a severe strain on local watersheds, often in areas that are already drought-prone, like the American Southwest.
Exactly. It's a massive physical footprint.
And the financial weight behind this physical build-out is shifting the entire global economy. Let's talk about the hyperscalers. Companies like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, which are building these data centers the size of small towns.
The capital expenditure numbers are hard to fathom.
They really are. In 2025 alone, the big four tech hyperscalers spent somewhere around $388 to $450 billion on AI capital expenditures. And the projections for 2026 are running toward $600 to $725 billion.
I mean, Microsoft alone guided roughly $80 billion in data center capital spending for fiscal 2025.
Just one company. You are looking at the wealth of nations being poured into the physical earth to build this digital heaven.
And the most immediate consequence of this hunger is its impact on the grid.
Right.
Data centers require reliable 24/7 baseload power. They cannot afford intermittent outages. Because of this sheer hunger, utilities in various regions are actually delaying their clean energy transitions.
This is the part that drives environmentalists crazy.
Yeah. They are keeping old, highly polluting coal and natural gas plants online simply because they need the massive baseload generation to feed the hyperscalers.
So the optimists are telling us that AI will eventually invent the clean energy future, that it will optimize the grid and discover fusion.
That's the promise.
But right now, in the physical present, AI is drinking the current grid dry and keeping coal alive.
That is the paradox of the transition period. We have to burn more to get to the point where we supposedly burn less.
But, I mean, the tech companies push back on this narrative heavily. They say, don't panic, our hardware and our models are getting exponentially more efficient. And the data actually backs them up.
It does.
In 2025, Google released a report showing they had cut the energy required for a single Gemini text query by a factor of 33. 33 times more efficient. So shouldn't that efficiency save us?
It seems like common sense that efficiency would reduce total demand. But if we connect this to the deeper mechanics of energy economics, we run headfirst into a very old, very stubborn concept.
The Jevons paradox.
Exactly, the digital Jevons paradox.
Walk us through the psychology and economics of this, because it is entirely counterintuitive.
So, William Stanley Jevons was an English economist who, in 1865, wrote a book called The Coal Question.
Okay, 1865, so right in the thick of the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. He was looking at coal consumption. The steam engine had just been vastly improved by James Watt. It was made much, much more efficient than previous models. Now, common sense dictated that a more efficient engine would use less coal to do the same amount of work, thereby reducing total coal consumption across the country.
That's what you would assume?
But Jevons observed the exact opposite.
Why? Because making it more efficient made it cheaper to operate.
Exactly. Making the steam engine more efficient lowered the marginal cost of mechanical work. Because it was cheaper and more profitable to use, industrialists didn't just run their existing factories on less coal.
What did they do?
They built vastly more steam engines. They applied them to entirely new industries like transport and agriculture. And as a result, total British coal consumption absolutely skyrocketed.
Ah, so efficiency didn't reduce demand, it induced new demand.
Yes. And this is exactly what researchers are warning about with AI today. Yes, Google made the Gemini model 33 times more efficient per query.
But making AI inference, the act of the AI actually generating a response cheaper and faster, doesn't mean we just do our current tasks with less energy.
Precisely. Lowering the cost of inference simply invites exponentially more queries. Instead of just using AI to write an occasional email, developers integrate an AI call into every single keystroke of a word processor.
Or every search query, every background software update.
Every NPC interaction in a video game. We spread the technology into places it previously wasn't cost-effective to use.
So total energy demand just keeps climbing exponentially. In this paradigm, efficiency is not the brake pedal. Efficiency is the accelerator.
It is the mechanism that expands the perimeter of consumption.
This is terrifying, because if efficiency is the accelerator, how does this end? I mean, I look back at our historical examples. The Pacific Northwest salmon run was incredibly abundant, but it had a natural biological ceiling.
Right, the salmon stopped running every autumn.
You could only catch what the river physically provided. The chinampas had a spatial limit. You could only build so many islands in Lake Texcoco. But this AI demand, it doesn't seem to have a natural ceiling.
It's a self-amplifying engine.
The smarter it gets, the more ways we find to use it. Are we just going to consume the entire physical biosphere in the pursuit of this digital abundance?
Well, this specific anxiety, the fear that a society will consume its own ecosystem to build its monuments, requires us to look very closely at the historical concept of collapse.
Okay.
And specifically, we need to look at the story of Rapa Nui, commonly known as Easter Island.
Oh, this is such a crucial piece of the puzzle, because the story of Rapa Nui is basically the ultimate bogeyman for environmental collapse, isn't it?
It is. For decades, it was the premier cautionary tale of an abundance-driven ecocide. The popular myth, which was heavily promoted by books like Jared Diamond's Collapse, was that Polynesian navigators arrived on a lush, forested island.
Right.
They had an abundance of food, and they used that surplus time to obsessively carve and transport those massive stone moai statues.
Right. The story we were all taught was that they became so obsessed with status and monument building that they cut down every single tree on the island to use as rollers to move the statues.
That was the theory.
Their population supposedly ballooned to 15 or 30,000 people, and then, without trees, The ecosystem completely collapsed. The soil eroded, they couldn't build canoes to fish, and they starved. They literally ate themselves out of house and home to build monuments.
It's the exact fear we have right now about AI data centers eating the electrical grid and the climate to build our digital monuments. Except the ancient DNA tells a completely different story.
This part completely upended everything I thought I knew about that island.
In 2024, a major genomic study was published. Researchers analyzed the ancient DNA of Rapa Nui individuals from before European contact.
Okay.
Now, if a population of 30,000 had crashed down to a few thousand due to starvation, that massive die-off would leave a very clear signature in the genome, a genetic bottleneck.
Right, a collapse in diversity.
Exactly. But the researchers found absolutely no signature of a pre-contact population collapse.
So the ecocide never happened.
It never happened. In fact, parallel studies analyzing land use and the isotopic composition of the soil in their rock mulch gardens implied a highly managed, perfectly sustainable population of only about 3,000 people.
They didn't overpopulate at all.
No, and they didn't destroy themselves. They adapted to their environment over centuries.
So what actually destroyed their society? Because something tragic obviously happened there.
The real catastrophe was entirely external. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raids descended on the island, capturing a massive portion of the population to work in guano mines.
Oh my God.
And the subsequent diseases brought by those outsiders and later missionaries crashed the Rapa Nui population down to about 110 people. The society was destroyed by the violent extraction of colonialism, not by their own ecological hubris.
The irony here is just staggering. Past civilizations, like the Rapa Nui, actually managed their ecological limits quite masterfully. They figured out how to sustainably build their massive stone monuments without destroying the island that kept them alive.
They lived within the bounds of their abundance.
But our self-amplifying digital engine currently shows no natural limit. We are the ones who might actually commit the ecocide we falsely accuse the Rapa Nui of.
It fundamentally reframes the modern optimistic claim. Because the modern technological salmon run doesn't just arrive for free in the river each year.
No.
It is a synthetic run. It must be built at enormous physical resource cost, and we have to actively, consciously decide how much of the river we are willing to dam to get it.
Okay, so let's shift gears from the physical limits of the Earth to the political limits of human society.
That's the next logical step.
Because if physical limits like the sheer amount of electricity we can generate or the copper we can mine might not stop the AI engine, what about governance?
Right.
Because right now, in the 2020s, the ability to build anything in the physical world, whether it's a data center, a solar farm, a transmission line, or even a high-density housing complex, is heavily, heavily restricted.
And this brings us right to the center of the live 2025 and 2026 policy debate, because there is a very powerful, very influential argument circulating right now that much of our scarcity isn't a problem of physics or resources.
It's a problem of governance.
Exactly.
We need to unpack the abundance agenda here. In March 2025, journalists Ezra Klein and Thompson published a book literally titled Abundance, and it became a massive, immediate #1 New York Times bestseller.
Which is rare for a policy book.
Very rare. For a dense policy book about infrastructure to hit #1, that tells you it struck a very deep nerve in the culture.
Their core thesis is really compelling. They argue that in the United States and across much of the developed world, the scarcity people experience daily, unaffordable housing, crumbling infrastructure, the painfully slow rollout of clean energy to replace fossil fuels.
Yeah.
They argue that it's not a fixed law of nature. It is what they call chosen scarcity.
Chosen scarcity, meaning we're doing it to ourselves through bureaucracy.
Exactly. They argue it is a self-inflicted failure of governance. Starting roughly in the 1970s, with the rise of the environmental movement, we built up these massive layers of well-intentioned processes.
Like what?
Laws like NEPA at the federal level, or CEQA in California. They were designed to force governments to study the environmental impacts of a project before building it.
Okay, explain CEQA specifically, because it becomes the massive battleground here. What is it, and how does it actually function mechanically?
CEQA stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. When it was passed, the goal was noble, right? Make sure the government isn't secretly approving a toxic waste dump next to a wetland or a neighborhood.
Sure, it makes total sense.
But over the decades, the mechanism of the law evolved. It allowed for a private right of action, meaning almost anyone could file a CEQA lawsuit anonymously to demand more environmental review, effectively freezing a project for years.
And that gets weaponized, doesn't it?
Oh, heavily weaponized. Klein and Thompson point out that these environmental review laws are frequently used by wealthy homeowners or rival businesses to block environmentally friendly projects.
So they use an environmental law to block the environment.
Yes. People use CEQA to block bike lanes, to block dense, affordable housing near transit centers, to block the very solar farms and transmission lines we need to solve climate change.
Wow.
The system created thousands of veto points, where a single angry person with a lawyer can stop a billion-dollar infrastructure project in its tracks.
So the abundance argument is that to actually unleash this latent technological and energy surplus to build the future, you have to clear the procedural underbrush. You need a politics of plenty that prioritizes building over endless review.
Exactly.
And what's wild is how fast this went from a theoretical best-selling book to actual binding law.
The legislative speed was truly remarkable.
In June 2025, just a few months after the book dropped, California enacted AB 130 and SB 131. This is the biggest, most aggressive overhaul of CEQA in decades.
A huge shift.
They explicitly exempted massive amounts of urban infill housing, clean energy, and semiconductor infrastructure from these brutal multi-year review processes. And the politicians literally branded it as an abundance agenda. They used the language of the book. The message was clear: just build.
But as impartial observers of this debate, we have to look deeply at the pushback. Because the Just Build framework has fierce, highly intelligent critics, particularly from the distributional left.
Right. We really need to steelman the critics here, like Samuel Moyn, who wrote a prominent, scathing review of the abundance agenda in the New York Times. What is the left's fundamental critique of Just Build?
The critics argue that the abundance framing dangerously underweights the realities of power, capital, and trade-offs. The argument is that Just Build sounds incredibly optimistic and progressive, but it ignores history.
In what sense?
Well, those environmental and community review processes, the very veto points Klein wants to clear away, were not put in place to annoy solar developers. They were put in place to protect vulnerable communities from being bulldozed by the state and massive corporations.
Oh, this makes me think of Robert Moses in New York in the mid-20th century.
That is the exact historical trauma they are pointing to. Before community review laws existed, urban planners like Robert Moses could simply draw a line on a map and bulldoze entire low-income minority neighborhoods in the Bronx to build the Cross-Bronx Expressway.
Just unilaterally destroy a neighborhood.
Yes. The critics argue that stripping away environmental reviews might increase the overall size of the economic pie, but it removes the only legal shield protecting those without political power.
I see the tension. If we nuke environmental reviews to build massive data centers and transmission lines for AI, aren't we just letting big tech steamroll vulnerable communities the same way highway planners did in the 1960s?
That is the fear.
The critics are basically asking, is the word abundance just a neutral-sounding Trojan horse being used to smuggle in aggressive, old-school corporate deregulation?
That is the exact crucible of the debate. Supporters of the abundance agenda say we're in a literal climate emergency and a crushing housing crisis. We can no longer afford the luxury of decade-long reviews, and the rules themselves have become the primary obstacle to progressive goals.
Right.
The critics respond that without those rules, capital will simply externalize its costs onto the poorest neighborhoods, just as it always has. The core problem from the critic's perspective isn't just the size of the pie. It is who controls the pie and who suffers the toxic externalities of the baking process.
It is a debate between informed people of good faith. And it highlights something incredibly profound. Getting to abundance is not an engineering problem. It is a deeply political act.
Which brings this modern 2025 political debate crashing directly into the historical findings of our deep dive series.
Yes, here's where it gets really interesting. Because this question of distribution, of who gets the benefits and who suffers the costs when a society hits a surplus, is exactly what we looked for in the history.
And the historical verdict is incredibly consistent and, frankly, a bit chilling.
It really is.
In all the prior cultures we examined, the surplus was real, the salmon runs were real, the chinampas were real, the Andean gold was real, and that surplus did create breathtaking art and monument. The techno-optimists are entirely correct about that mechanism. But the surplus never distributed itself evenly, not once.
It never automatically trickled down to create an egalitarian paradise. Every single abundance culture we looked at cast a long, dark shadow. Let's walk through that shadow.
We can start back on the salmon coast of the Pacific Northwest. They carved beautiful totem poles, and the chiefs threw those incredible potlatch feasts we discussed, giving away massive wealth.
Right.
But that society was also rigidly stratified. They had hereditary nobility, commoners, and a brutal system of slavery.
Up to a quarter of some populations on that coast were enslaved individuals.
Yes, often captured in war from neighboring tribes. Their forced labor is what subsidized the leisure and the monumental art of the nobility.
And the cruelty of the hierarchy was baked into the potlatch itself, wasn't it?
It was. Sometimes, slaves were killed during a potlatch as a grotesque display of a chief's absolute wealth and power, demonstrating that he was so rich he could destroy human property. The abundance rested on a foundation of bondage.
Just brutal. And the Aztec chinampas. They fed the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan and allowed for the creation of complex astronomy and writing. But that same massive agricultural surplus underwrote a highly militarized state.
Oh, heavily militarized.
It fed an imperial army that subjected neighboring city-states to crushing tribute demands, and a state religion that required mass human sacrifice to legitimize the ruling elite. The abundance fed coercion just as efficiently as it fed art.
And we cannot forget the Muisca in the Andes. They had the agricultural surplus to support a specialized artisan class that mastered the lost wax casting of Tumbaga gold.
Right. They created the famous golden raft to depict the El Dorado offering ceremony, literally throwing massive amounts of gold into Lake Guatavita as a spiritual gift to their gods.
It was a beautiful cosmology. But that exact same visible abundance is what drew the Spanish conquest like a magnet. The gold that was their sacred offering became the bait for their destruction.
Francisco Pizarro and Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada didn't march into the Andes because it was poor.
No, they didn't.
They marched in because the abundance was visible and unprotected.
Which brings us to the fork in the road for artificial intelligence and the modern energy grid.
So to the student of energy economics listening right now, when you are modeling the future of the grid or looking at the massive productivity gains promised by AI, the political economy of who actually owns the AI engine isn't just an interesting footnote.
It is the entire debate.
Exactly. The central question of our era is this. Will the massive productivity gains of AI be used to fund a broad floor for humanity? Will it be taxed and governed to fund universal basic income or universal basic services or shorter working hours, a society where freed time becomes culture and dignity for everyone? Or will it be a private hoard?
Will the surplus be captured entirely by whoever owns the proprietary large language models, the hyperscale data centers, and the energy grids?
Because if history is any guide, an ungoverned AI abundance leads to massive labor displacement for the many and unimaginable pharaoh-level wealth for the few.
History screams that the surplus will concentrate unless it is actively politically forced to do otherwise.
Which is why the single most vital historical parallel in this entire series isn't the mighty Aztec Empire or the wealthy salmon chiefs or the builders of the moai. It is the Guna people of San Blas, Panama.
The Guna are the great exception to the rule of concentrated abundance, and therefore they are the great lesson.
Yes. They are the only culture in this series that successfully kept their abundance and their cultural autonomy into the modern era. If you go to the San Blas Islands today, which they call Gunayala, you can see Guna women sewing their beautiful mola textile.
And the molas are extraordinary. They are intricate, multi-layered, reverse applique cloths that depict everything from local mythology to modern political events.
And the women still wear their traditional gold nose rings and necklaces. It is a living, breathing surplus culture. But we have to ask why they kept it.
Because it wasn't because they had better military technology than the Spanish or the Panamanians.
Oh, definitely not.
It wasn't because their geographic surplus was magically immune to human greed.
They kept their abundance because they organized politically to defend it. Let's talk about the 1925 revolution, because this is the blueprint. In the early 20th century, the Panamanian government pursued aggressive, violent assimilation policies against the Guna.
The Panamanian colonial police, known as the Waga, set up outposts on the islands. They explicitly targeted the Guna's cultural abundance.
They tried to ban the culture, right?
Yes. They tried to legally ban the making of molas and the wearing of traditional gold jewelry, trying to force the Guna women into Western mass-produced dresses. They wanted to break the cultural identity to assimilate the territory.
And the Guna didn't just sit back and trust that their beautiful art would somehow protect them. They didn't rely on the moral arc of the universe. They fought back.
Led by figures like Nelly Cantuli, they meticulously planned an uprising. In February 1925, the Guna launched a coordinated revolution across the islands. They drove out the colonial police in armed conflict.
And crucially, they forced the Panamanian government to the negotiating table. With an American cruiser, the USS Cleveland, sitting offshore observing, the Guna negotiated a peace treaty that guaranteed their cultural autonomy and territorial rights.
They won the right to govern their own abundance.
If we synthesize the grand lesson of all these deep dives, combining the history with the modern energy and AI projections, it is this. Abundance survives where it is governed and guarded. It decays into hierarchy, or it is seized by external forces where it is merely assumed.
The boardroom promise of an automatic, frictionless age of abundance where technology just naturally solves human conflict is a historical fantasy. The technological surplus provides the opportunity for utopia, but human politics dictates the actual outcome.
The modern AI abundance won't share itself out of the goodness of its algorithmic heart. The clean energy transition won't automatically dismantle wealth inequality just because solar panels are cheap. We have to govern it.
We have to make aggressive, structural choices about distribution, just like the Guna did.
So as we reach the conclusion of this analysis, we should look back one final time at the four great historical witnesses we've uncovered in this series. What do they tell us about the AI future staring us down?
Well, we look first to the totem pole of the Pacific Northwest. It is surplus made visible. It proves that human beings truly long to make meaning and art out of their free time.
But we remember that it was built on a foundation of rigid rank and bondage. When we look at the AI surplus, the totem asks us the fundamental question. Abundance for whom?
We look next to the raft, the chinampa gardens engineered in the lakebed of Tenochtitlan. It represents the structural logic of engineering a baseline guarantee of enough, the exact same bet that universal basic income and universal basic services are making today.
But the raft asks us, is this a guarantee we are willing to physically build, govern, and defend against monopoly? Or is it just a comforting fantasy we are promised in a boardroom pitch?
We look to the moai, the massive stone giants of Rapa Nui. They represent the monumental, the magnificent, and the cautionary. They survived sustainably, but the society was eventually ravaged by extractive, external forces they couldn't control.
The moai ask us, what do we choose to build with our massive expenditure of energy, and what does the building ultimately cost the physical world?
And finally, we look to the mola, the living, vibrant, layered textile art of the Guna. The one abundance in this entire series that survived intact because a people fought a revolution for their right to keep it and govern it themselves.
The mola tells us the ultimate historical truth. Abundance kept is abundance governed. History tells us with almost complete certainty that the technological and energy surplus is coming. The cost curves for solar and storage don't lie.
The intelligence of the AI models is scaling exponentially. The machine is being built.
But history also tells us with absolute unflinching certainty that it will not share itself. Equity is not an inevitable byproduct of technology. It is a choice.
And that is the final thought for our listeners. The tools to create post-scarcity are being assembled right now, but the architecture of how we share it is entirely unwritten.
To the student of energy economics running your projections for the decades ahead, and to anyone listening who is trying to navigate this incredibly strange, fast-moving future, the stone is in front of us, the energy is flowing, the river is full, so what will we carve?